My op-ed today over at HartmannReport.com it combines two ways, two very kind of popular and widespread ways of looking at history that political historians, shall we say, have been looking at. I've shared with you many times over the years the Strauss and Howe. It's interesting. One of them was a conservative, one was a liberal. But they wrote a couple of brilliant books, Generations, this was back in the 90s, Generations and The Fourth Turning, I think came out in 98. And in The Fourth Turning, they suggest that basically every 80 years, America suffers from a severe economic crisis, followed by a war, followed by essentially a progressive reboot. The first one was in the 1770s. There was such a softening of the economy in 1773 that it led to the Tea Act, and the Stamp Act. I mean, the Congress or the Parliament of the UK doing all these things to raise money and help out the British East India Company. And that led right to the American Revolution. That was the first one. The second one, the Great Panic of 1856, where Abraham Lincoln made it to his bank literally with hours to spare, and which I've written about in, as I recall, in Unequal Protection. And that was followed by the Civil War. That was 80 years after the American Revolution. 80 years after the Civil War, you had the the Republican Great Depression of the 1930s, followed by World War II, which resolved in 1945. And of course, we are now just 4 years short of 80 years away from that, which would suggest time for another depression and war. Maybe, maybe not. Maybe what we're looking at are cycles within cycles, which I think is a fascinating perspective. Stephen Skowronek, in a 1993 book called Politics Presidents Make, wrote about this. It was revived by in the New York Times last week by Professor Corey Robin. He notes that instead we should be thinking in terms of regimes. That you get a president and he has a regime, and the regime lasts longer than the president, sometimes even longer than the president lives. And I'll get to I'll fill in just a second. The Jeffersonian regime lasted from 1800 to 1828, he writes. This is in the New York Times. The Jacksonian regime from 1828 to 1860, the Republican regime, this is the basically Civil War and post-Civil War, from 1860 to 1932, the New Deal order from 1932 to 1980. And now we're at the end of the Reagan regime, which started in 1981. And now it's 40 years down the road from that. And he notes that when regimes are ending, what happens is that the party aligned with the regime starts losing power. The party opposed to the regime starts gaining power. Now, aligned with the Reagan regime was the Republicans, opposed to it was the Democrats. And that the old regime becomes calcified, it becomes brittle, it becomes fragile, it's less vigorous. Whereas the new regime is where all the energy is, right? And this new regime, frankly, I would say is the new progressive regime. We're seeing it in these moves to unionize. We're seeing it in things like, here in Oregon, we've decriminalized all drugs, except for pharmaceuticals, of course. We have, we've got, and we're, among other states as well to do this, have a right to die with dignity. I mean, abortion is pretty solid here. In fact, California is preparing for after the Supreme Court ends Roe v. Wade by establishing abortion and birth control, which is the next big battlefield that is coming. In fact, it's already started. Texas, SB 4 went into effect last week. SB 8 was the one everybody knows about, right? The one that said that you can make a $10,000 bounty by turning in somebody who helps a woman get an abortion. SB 4 just went into effect last week, and it limits the availability and the number of weeks after which, after conception, during which you can use these pills that will induce an abortion. And so, Texas is really clamping down. This whole movement to put women back in the bedroom and the kitchen, on the part of these white men in Texas who are running that state, is going into overdrive, and it's being picked up by red states all around the country. At the same time, blue states are moving in the exact opposite direction and saying, we acknowledge that women have rights equal to men. and they should be able to control their own fertility, their own reproductive capacity, and like that. So where does this go? There's a famous quote from Antonio Gramsci. He was the founder of Italy's Communist Party, and he was put into prison in 1927 by Mussolini. And from prison, in his prison diaries, he wrote, "The old is dying and the new cannot be born. In this interregnum, a great variety of morbid symptoms appear." I would submit to you that the rise of Trump's neo-fascism and the whole Trumpy thing is that morbid symptom that shows up during the interregnum, during that transition period before the new has been born and before the old completely dies, but as both are happening. And therefore, if this analysis of history is accurate, and I believe it is, I'm not, in fact, I think I've got some pretty good evidence to back it up in this article that I published this morning over at HartmannReport.com. If that's true, then the whole Trumpy phenomenon is going to be a temporary one. It'll be short-lived. And, it'll just be something that's happening around that transition, that power transition. So I'm actually very optimistic, although the 80-year cycles kind of gives me pause. But I wrap up the article today by saying, as the old cliche goes, we face a moment of great danger, but also one of great opportunity. And I think that that's very much the case.